Mr. Roig-Frankl writes in Chapter 4 that first inversion triads are usually prolongational chords. Okay, so normally when we're using a 1-6 or a 4-6 or a 5-6, and we'll even see that in other first inversion triads when we get to them, their main function is going to be to prolong another triad or maybe to prolong the same triad. I've made up a little list of different prolongational tactics that can be used with these first inversion triads, and I'd like to take a look at that list with you. Understanding this page of examples will depend a little bit on your being able to picture the scale degrees that are in the bass for these different chords. And you may not be very quick at this right now, but I would really suggest that you get to know the scale degrees that would be used in the bass for various chords. This will help you later on with analysis. It will help you if you play the keyboard or play a bass instrument with improvising. Really try to think about what the scale degrees are that are used in these different triads. Let's just quickly review that. With a root position 1 chord, Do is in the bass, and with a first inversion, Mi or Me is in the bass. With a 4 chord, Fa is in the bass, and with a 4-6, La or Lay is in the bass. And finally, with a 5 chord, if it's in root position, Sol is in the bass, and if it's in first position, Ti is in the bass. I've written all of these examples from the point of view of the major mode, but please note that these would be the same simply with a vowel change between Me and Mi, between La and Lay, if we were in minor. So the first category is prolongation by arpeggiation within the same triad. So that means going from 1 to 1-6, from 1-6 to 1. It might mean going from 4 to 4-6, or maybe even from 4 to 4-6 and back to 4. Or it could mean going from 5 to 5-6. So the bass line in each of these cases would be Do to Mi, Mi to Do, Fa to La, or Fa to La back to Fa, Sol to Ti. And down below, I've shown you the second level analysis that shows a single triad function being prolonged by arpeggiation. Another possibility is that we might have prolongation by arpeggiation, but featuring different triads. And so far with the primary triads, the only chords that this works with is using a 4-6 to prolong a 1 chord. If we go from a 1 to a 4-6 to a 1-6, we're arpeggiating downward. So we're going Do, La, Mi. Or we could go back to a root position 1. That would be Do, La, Do. Either of those features a prolongation of tonic harmony through arpeggiation. Another important type of bass motion that we can have with prolongation is neighbor motion. And this can feature either lower neighbor motion or upper neighbor motion. The 1-5-1 progression goes Do, Ti, Do, and that's a prolongation of 1 with the bass featuring lower neighbor motion. We can do the same sort of thing prolonging 4. Fa, Mi, Fa, that's prolonging 4. We can also have a 5 chord prolonged through upper neighbor motion. Sol, La, Sol. That's, again, a prolongation of dominant. Sometimes we may have neighbor motion only on one side and have that incomplete neighbor motion be the best descriptor for the prolongation. Often this occurs by leaping to a tendency tone in the bass and then resolving that tendency tone. So for example, if we're on a 1-6 chord, we can leap in the bass down to a leading tone and then resolve it up to Do. It's better to leap down because then the subsequent motion is in the opposite direction. Remember in Chapter F, we learned about that balancing motion in melodies. Another possibility with a little bit less of a tendency would be to go from a Do to a La and then resolve the La down to Sol. This would be much stronger if we were in minor and we had a minor 4/6 chord. In that case, the bass would be lay, and lay is a very strong tendency tone wanting to go to 5. So the bass line, do, lay, sol, is pretty forceful. And finally, we don't have a lot of examples of this yet with just the primary triads, but we can also have passing motion in the bass, either up or down. For example, in the bass going from sol to la to ti, we can have the chord progression 5 to 4/6 to 5/6. In this case, the 5 chord is being prolonged. We're arpeggiating in the bass from 5 to 5/6, but we're filling that arpeggiation in with passing motion. Okay, let's look at an example from a handout. I'm going to post this handout on Canvas, but I'm also going to photocopy it and give it to you on Monday, October 12th. So eventually you'll have your own fabulous paper copy of this handout. Okay, example 1 is a longer example, and for a change it's in minor. And I'll play this for you, and then I'll just point out the type of prolongational motion that we have for the first inversion triads. Not so much for the 2 diminished 6 at the end of the progression. This is really more of a structural chord. It's leading into the cadence. So our final motion here is predominant to dominant to tonic. But the other first inversion chords that we'll see along the way feature the types of prolongational motion that I was just talking about. The progression starts out with a 1-5-6-1 progression. This is featuring lower neighbor motion in the bass. It would also be correct to say that there's passing motion here, because look at what the soprano is doing. It's passing up from do to re to mi. As we go from 1 to 4/6 to 5, this is now incomplete neighbor motion. In the bass, we're leaping to the strong tendency tone lay, which is then resolving down to 5. The F is like a neighbor note to the E, but it's an incomplete neighbor because it's approached by leap. It's only a neighbor on the right-hand side of it. With this incomplete neighbor motion in the bass, again, we're seeing some passing motion in the soprano. Moving on, this progression, featuring the leading tone triad, which we haven't really talked about yet, but we'll get to soon. Here we have a 1/6 to a 7 diminished 6 to a 1. And notice that in the bass there is passing motion. So we're prolonging tonic harmony with passing motion in the bass. In the soprano we have lower neighbor motion. Here, 1 to 4/6 to 1, we have arpeggiation in the bass. We're prolonging tonic harmony with the soprano remaining static. We do have neighbor motion in the upper voices, and we have this arpeggiation in the bass, but this time it's featuring chords that are not the same chord. On the other hand, in the next measure, we have 2 chords that are the same harmony, both A minor, and so here we're featuring arpeggiation within the tonic triad. Okay, so here we've seen all 5 different kinds of prolongation that I talked about just a minute ago. Prolongation by arpeggiation using the same triad, prolongation using arpeggiation between 2 different triads. We saw neighbor motion, we saw incomplete neighbor motion, and we saw passing motion. I'll play the progression again. I'd like to turn next to a couple of examples that are in your textbook, and I want to look these over and introduce you to a little bit of new vocabulary. We'll also be beginning to think about voice leading, but that's more the subject of my third lecture. Okay, let's take a look at example 4.3. This is showing different voice leading when tonic harmony is being prolonged through arpeggiation, either 1 to 1/6 or 1/6 to 1. The voice leading that we're shown here would also hold true if we were prolonging 4 by going from 4 to 4/6, and of course it would also hold true if we were prolonging 5. So let's take a look at example 4.3a. Here's this example. Look at what's happening between the bass and the soprano in this example. Notice that the tenor and the alto are remaining stationary, so we're actually keeping two notes the same while the outer voices move. And what's happening is that in the first chord, the bass has an A and the soprano has a C. And then in the second chord, the position of those two notes is exchanged. So now the bass has a C and the soprano has an A. This is called a voice exchange, and that's a term that you should know. So I'm highlighting that term voice exchange in the text. The idea is that the bass and the soprano quite literally swap notes, and that's what this little X here is showing. It's showing a voice exchange. Voice exchange doesn't have to be between the bass and the soprano. It can be between any two voices, but it's particularly common between the bass and the soprano, also common between the bass and another upper voice. And it's a very good way of ensuring that you have good voice leading and good doubling when you're using this type of prolongation of a harmony. Another type of voice leading is shown in letter B. Here we're moving from a 1 to a 1/6 chord. One voice is remaining stationary. Remember that when we have a change of position, we always want one or two voices to be stationary. And then the other voices are moving up. And specifically, the soprano voice is moving from C to E, and that's making parallel tenths with the bass A to C. Let me play example B for you. So that parallel tenth motion, also a good way of doing your part writing. Always be careful, though, that as you move from a root position triad to the first inversion triad, don't go from the root to the third in another voice. That would give you parallel octaves. Example 4.4 shows the same kind of prolongation by arpeggiation that we have just seen in example 4.3. Now the chords that are being prolonged are the 4 chord in example A and the 5 chord in example B. See if you can figure out which of these examples uses parallel tenths and which of these examples uses a voice exchange to prolong the 4 chord and the 5 chord. If you said that the motion from the 4 to the 4/6 chord employs voice exchange, you're correct. See how the 4 chord has D in the bass and F in the soprano? And then the two voices literally exchange notes. Now the bass has the F in the bass and the D in the soprano. If you said that the 5 to 5/6 features parallel tenths, you are correct. The bass goes from sol to T, and the soprano goes from T to re. Notice that the leading tone is transferred into the bass, and then it resolves in the bass. It's very important that you never put two leading tones in the same chord. Your root position 5 chord should have one leading tone in the upper voices, but no more. Your 5/6 chord has the leading tone in the bass, so the leading tone should absolutely not be in the upper voices. The leading tone is a very strong tendency tone, and if you have two leading tones in the same chord, even if you don't have parallel octaves, it's going to sound like you have parallel octaves because our ear is going to want to hear both of those leading tones resolving to tonic. We'll take a quick look next at some examples featuring some of the other types of motion that I discussed. Example 4.5 shows lower neighbor motion in the bass as we go from 1 to 5/6 to 1. We also have lower neighbor motion in the tenor, and we have upper neighbor motion in the soprano. Again, be careful about parallels. The octave Bs are approached by contrary motion, and they're left by contrary motion. The only parallel motion we have is the parallel thirds between the bass and the tenor. Another example of neighbor motion is example 4.7a. Here we have neighbor motion in the bass, but now we have passing motion in two of the upper voices. The soprano goes do, re, mi, and the tenor goes mi, re, do. Notice the lines here, these kinds of lines that trace an X between two pairs of voices in two chords always indicates a voice exchange. Here the voice exchange is between the tenor and the soprano. Here are a couple of examples of incomplete neighbor motion. I described and even sang to you the leap in the bass from mi to ti to do, always resolving that leading tone to do if it's in either the soprano or the bass. So here we're leaping to the G sharp, and then the G sharp resolves as a neighbor to A. It's a neighbor only on the right side of it. And going along with this, we have passing motion in the soprano. Notice again that we have a voice exchange. This time it's not marked in, but we have a voice exchange between the tenor and the soprano. The tenor is on C sharp, the soprano is on A, and then when we move to the final one chord, the tenor is on A, and the soprano is on C sharp. The same thing also happens between the bass and the soprano. Even though there's an octave between the C sharps on beat 1 and an octave between the A's on beat 3, this is not a case of parallel octaves because there's an intervening pair of notes here. In lecture 3, we'll get more into the nitty-gritty of part writing, but this gives you a little bit of an overview of the different kinds of prolongational motion that you can achieve using first inversion chords.